What up, everybody? Happy Friday. You made it to the end of the week. It's an awesome thing. Hopefully you made some money. It's Paul Abernethy here with another mobile Let's Ask Paul podcast. So, I've been getting quite a few requests on TikTok and other platforms who really, it seems that people are struggling with the concept of adjustment and correction. I don't get it. But I think it's because I got it early on in my career that I understood what taking something for ampacity and doing an adjustment and correction for it. And I think because it hit home with me, I can't really relate, even though I teach thousands of people this type of concept. I still, again, I'm not sure why people don't get it, but the good news is, Derating Demystified 3.0 should drop this weekend, and it really does explain adjustment and corrections, in an effort to try to explain it to people so they kind of understand it. And once you understand it, you get it, right? So, I guess a synopsis for those that are listening that really struggle with adjustment and correction and what that means in the code. So when you think about the ampacity tables 31016 in the National Electrical Code, which is obviously that's our workhorse when it comes to the ampacities of conductors. That table is really based on a specific condition of use, right? So the ampacities that you see in 31016 are based on those are all actually continuous loads, believe it or not. Okay? I mean, when we say continuous loads, meaning it's not treated as a continuous load. It just means that all of those loads that are in that table could run continuously forever and not have an issue with causing a problem with the insulation. Now, see, that's going to be shocking to some people. But, for example, a 60-degree column, a 6-gauge, 55 amps, can pull 55 amps forever and never hurt the wire, ever, as long as you meet the conditions of the table. So what are the conditions of the table? Well, 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So we tend to deal a lot in Fahrenheits and stuff like that, even though we get most of the stuff comes in Celsius when we buy. But we have to kind of look at things and go, okay, what are we, are we ever going to be in that perfect condition? Are we ever going to be in a situation where everything is 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit? And so a lot of people, when they do installations, they never give this much thought, right? Because, again, normal residential installations, everything's in the walls, right? So they don't worry about it too much. Or everything that's inside of a building's pretty conditioned, right? Don't worry about it too much. But when you run cables or even raceways up through, let's say, attics that are not conditioned space, then you have an elevated ambient temperature that can have an effect on the ampacity that a conductor can carry. Elevated heat is not good, let's put it that way. If you're trying to keep the heat associated with a conductor to a certain level because of a rating of the insulation, right? If you're trying to keep that to a certain level, then you got to remember that it's not going to be good if you're putting current through it, and that generates heat, and then you're putting the conductor itself in an ambient temperature that has elevated heat. Then it's going to reduce the amount of current that the conductor can carry safely before the insulation's temperature rating gets breached, right? So if the insulation is rated 60 degree and the table ampacity is based on at 30 degrees Celsius, then it doesn't take but 30 degrees of a rise in order to get to the point where you could have a problem with the insulation on the conductor, not the sheathing. Like a non-metallic product, but the sheathing is generally rated the same as the insulation generally, but it's not insulation, so you don't treat it as such. It's just sheathing, protective sheathing. So we're talking about the insulation on the conductor. So you've only got that factor of 30 degrees. So now if I take a conductor and I'm running current through it, which is going to generate heat, and now I put it in an attic, let's say, where where it's unconditioned, especially like say an attic in Texas, just using the Texas as an example, then you're going to have this elevated ambient temperature that's going to rise again. So ultimately what happens is it exposes that insulation to an elevated temperature that could rapidly exceed the rating of the conductor's listing, which is 60 degrees C, right? So that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to limit. So the only way to do that or combat that is to adjust the level of ampacity that we're allowed to put on that conductor because of these ambient temperatures. And that's why we use something called a correction. And you're going to look at 310.15 B1. And I think 2023 it's B11 table. So that's kind of what we have to do. We have to do something to the conductor because we have a situation where we're going to have elevated temperatures, elevated ambient temperatures that are not what's given to us in 310.16. Because remember, 310.16 is a very finite values of conditions. It's based on 30 degrees Celsius and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. That's it. So anytime it deviates from that, right, we have to make a correction. Now, we talk about adjustments. It's essentially the same concept. With an adjustment, the table in 310.16 talks about the number of current carrying conductors. So when you have more than 3 current carrying conductors, then you're deviating from what that table is based on. Now, why is that a problem? Well, when you put a lot of current carrying conductors in raceways, or maybe you even bundle cables for more than 24 inches, or you throw them in thermal insulation, like with 334.80 for non-metallic sheet cable, and you put more than 2 cables in a bundle and in contact with thermal, what happens is now heat can't dissipate. You have what's called mutual heating from the other conductors, and that's going to cause a contribution to the conductor's insulation to start be a problem, because the heat's going to start to elevate due to this mutual contribution from all this heat generated from these conductors, and now they're all running together, bundled, and they're going to collectively bring more heat to expose this insulation that's on the conductor. And so you rapidly get to the threshold of the rating of the insulation, and that's when you start having problems. Now, cross-linked polyethylene, XHHW, is a little more forgiving, obviously, than thermoplastic like THHN. And in non-metallic sheet cable, it's not necessarily THHN, it's equivalent to THHN or TW, which means it's not exactly the same. It doesn't have nylon on it, which really brings nothing anyway. But normal THHN has a nylon. It's not that. It has to be tested to be equivalent to THHN and meet all the normal properties that we would see and for testing the conductors and stuff like that. It has to meet all that, but it doesn't have to go through the same. It's not THHN/THWN. It's not been rated for the water or moisture and all that type of exposure. So it's not the same. A lot of people say that it's the same. It's not. It's equivalent as far as meeting certain tests, but it's not exactly the same. Okay. So if we've got something that's going to affect the potential ampacity of a conductor, whether we're bundling more than 3 current carrying conductors in raceways or bundling cables, now we have to do an adjustment. And the adjustment starts at 4 current carrying conductors and up. And that you're going to have to go to 310.15 C1. Okay? And make that adjustment. Now, if you're in the 2017 code, these code references are a little different if you're lagging behind. It would be 310.15 B2A and B3A. Okay, unless you're your state's just lagging behind. But at the end of the day, that's Those are adjustment and corrections. Now, people are confused because you hear us say that you can't use the 90-degree table in 310/16 ampacity. Just flat out. You just can't use it, like just in an everyday application. Now, not 100% true. You could if all of the lugs that you're dealing with, and that's the weakest link there. If all the lugs that I'm dealing with are rated 90, insulation of the conductor is rated 90, if everything in the equation, the device that you're terminating to, the lugs are rated 90, if everything is rated 90, then you most certainly could use the 90. But here's the problem. Typically, lugs aren't rated 90. Okay? They're rated 60/75. Right? So you gotta worry about the lug limitations. And that's when you have to be really conscious, is that what it is? You have to be really aware, how about that, of 110.14c. Right? And that is temperature, and I like to say terminal limitations. Because that's where it talks about if you're up to 1 gauge and less and you're 100 amps or less, you're going to default to the 60-degree column for ampacities. If you're over 1, okay, you're over 1 and up, right, and your ampacities are over 100 amps, then you're going to default at the 75. Now, 310.15 reminds us that we can use the 90 for adjustment and corrective purposes. Okay, so that means you can start these adjustment and corrections where you have this ambient or more than 3 current. You can start doing your math from the higher 90-degree value. Okay, provided that your conductor is rated for 90. Okay, that's key. It's got to be conductor's insulation. It's got to be rated for 90 before you can even do that. All right, now and in that scenario, all you're doing is starting at a higher number so that you can do the math, and you're ultimately going to get a lower number most of the time for a conductor's new ampacity. Well, once you do that, you have to make sure, one, that the new ampacity still can handle whatever the load is that's in question. And two, you got to go all the way back to the table that you should have been in the first place, whether it's 75 degree or 60, and make sure that your load still doesn't exceed the value that's in that table for that specific size conductor, right? So even though you're after the math from the 90, your conductor may have more ampacity than what's in the 60 or 75 degree column, you still can't use that extra value. You're still going to be stuck in the 75 or 60. Why do we do that? Well, we do that because, one, we just want to make sure that even after adjustment and corrective, that we, one, have a conductor that's still feasible to handle our load. And then two, we want to make sure that we're not going to be using the conductor in excess of what the value is in the 75 or the 60 degree column. Now, funny thing here is that you could do an adjustment or correction, and now your conductor is like way below the value that's in the 75 degree column, let's say. And then you're like, well, what the hell do I do now? I need a certain number of amps. And now after this adjustment or correction to my conductor's ampacity, I don't have enough for this conductor size that I want. Well, guess what? You got to jump up to the next size conductor, larger. And then you redo the math again and make sure that, one, it can handle the load, and two, that it still has the ability to carry the load after you do the adjustment or correction, and that you're not exceeding the value within that 75 and 60 degree column. Hey, get it. Look. You're electricians. This is some tough shit. Believe it or not, I find that some of the hardest things for electricians to grasp is adjustment and corrections. So I'm going to do you a favor. When I put out the D-Rating Demystified 3.0, it's going to be available on my YouTube channel for 1 full week, free of charge. After that week, it's going to be moved over to fasttrackstube.com exclusively for our subscribers. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to give you a chance because I think everybody out there needs to understand adjustment and corrections. I think you need to understand, because I see people on TikTok and Instagram and all that and say, hey, I've ran my conductor and I've exceeded the ampacity values and I've been doing it for a year and never a problem. First of all, I can't fix stupid. I can't. All we can do is attempt to moderate it and educate it. That's all we can do. But at the end of the day, just because something hasn't caused you a problem now doesn't mean it won't in the future. And when you're building or wiring a house, you have to think about the future, right? There's many people that argue, I don't want to put this in because it's my house, you're building my house. But you know what? We're all going to die. Somebody else is going to be living in your house eventually. Whether you sell it or you die and pass it on, we have to be good stewards of the code as a minimum standard to protect other people. That's just why we do what we do. And it took me a while to realize that it's not about what you want. It's about the people that will eventually be good stewards of your property, hopefully, and protecting them. So that's why we do things at a standard. It's not because I don't want it. You don't really have a choice. The standard is what it is. Do it to the standard, follow the rules, because other people are going to be affected eventually, you know? So anyway, hopefully got something out of that. I know that was kind of hard to get all that in a short time. Hopefully you got something and understand about adjustment and corrections. Remember, the rules in 310.15 allow us to use the 90 for adjustment and corrective purposes as long as the insulation is rated 90. And you use that 90 when you go to the correction table in 310.15B11. That's where you're going to be. If it's 90-degree rated insulation, you're going to be in the 90-degree column. Okay, so you have to make sure your conductor has 90-degree insulation before you can even use that elevated value, first off. And just remember, if you have more than 3 current carrying conductors, or you have bundling of cables, or if you're putting non-metallic sheet cable, let's say, in thermal insulation, or through bored holes that have thermal insulation, all those type of things, you're going to have to do a adjustment or correction depending on what condition you're at. And just remember, 310.16 is based on a specific condition. Those ampacities that you see in that table are based on 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? And in the real world, that's not going to be what you're dealing with. You're going to have to do some type of adjustment or correction. So get used to it, embrace it, and learn it. And I'll catch you in the next mobile episode. Take care.